Hi everybody, I'm Salvo. I know many of you here. I'm the Executive Director of the Legacy Project, which, if you don't know, is the organization that celebrates the contributions LGBT people have made to world history and culture. We run the Legacy Walk installation on North Halsted Street, which is the only LGBT outdoor museum walk dedicated to celebrating our contributions to world history and culture. Our database contains about 250 names of people from pretty much every kind of background that you can imagine, 36 countries, 21 fields of contribution, spanning 4,000 years of history, and many people among there were transgender. And we've taken on a new sort of programmatic policy to try and create small displays of our content to bring into other events in order to connect the historic component of our history to the topics that we're currently talking about. And the plaques that we selected today are just a handful of transgender people who actually served in the military in various capacities in various wars going back to, I think, the 1500s. I can't remember right on content, but sorry. But it's been several centuries in several different countries. And it doesn't necessarily speak to the challenges that we're talking about today and what transgender people face in the military today. But the whole purpose for it to be here is just to remind people that we have a past. And we've always had that past. We've always been part of humanity's story. And this is just a small way in which we try to tie the present and the past together. So thanks for letting us come.
So now it is my pleasure to introduce my partner of 20 years, who she served 20 years as my partner. She also served 20 years in the United States Air Force as a master sergeant. So she's going to introduce our speaker.
Which do you think was more challenging? Since 1999, Erin Belkin has served as the founding director of the Michael D. Palm Center, a research institute think tank research initiative associated with the San Francisco State University, where he is professor. Leading up to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Repeal Act of 2010 and implementation in September 20, on September 2011, Erin Belkin and the Palm Center worked tirelessly to produce social science scholarship to inform public discussion about gays in the military. He is the author of many books. His 2011 book, How We Won, looks back at the work to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and has been called a standard for civil rights work best practices going forward. His most recent book relating to militarism and gender is the 2011 Bringing Men on Masculinity in Military Culture. All of this leads Erin Belkin to his current work, shedding light on the topic of transgender people in military service. Erin, thank you for being here to discuss this topic with us.
Is this okay without the mic?
Yes.
If it's not, just speak up. I have a really bad memory. Doctor says not to worry. Jim Darby walked in a few minutes ago. Jim, most of you probably know, has been a leader in the fight to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the fight for equality for decades. And Jim tells me that we met 14 years ago at a conference in Denver, which I do actually remember. But what I didn't remember is he said that he came up to me when we met 14 years ago and said, I really thought you were going to be a stodgy old professor. And supposedly, unless you're, I don't know, supposedly, I said, well, I thought you were going to be a stodgy old veteran. That was our first meeting. I'm so grateful to Sam Test and Northern Trust, and of course the wonderful hospitality here at Keith House. Thank you so much. Both of you have been very generous in hosting this event, so thank you. I'd like to talk from the perspective of where I think many people in the community are, which is that Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal is obviously over, but how do we think about the military's transgender policy? What is it? Why is it important? What needs to be done to get rid of it? And what is being done right now? And I'll speak for a few minutes, and then if you have questions or comments, we can have a more kind of interactive discussion. The transgender ban is important. It's important because there are 15,500 transgender troops serving currently, and transgender service members get fired if they're discovered to be trans, so that means they have to lie about who they are. They can't access medically necessary health care, like everyone else in the military. And they can't even get into the military in the first place if military recruiters find out that they're trans. So the policy is very, very bad, and I'll explain the policy in a minute, but just taking as a placeholder that there is a ban. The policy is bad from a rights perspective because there are 15,500 people in our community who don't have access to their basic rights. I would say even more broadly than that, even if people are not interested in the military or the welfare of the troops, that this ban is one of the most odious sites in American democracy and American citizenship, at least in terms of policy, because it is the only place, at least that I can find in federal regulations, that requires discrimination. The military must discriminate against transgender people. So it's not even a case of, oh, there's some leeway or some wiggle room, but here's a case where federal regulation requires the state to go after a class of people just for who they are. And that, to me, is a very dangerous precedent and not what American citizenship or democracy should be about. That cheapens the meaning of citizenship to me when we maintain policies that force the government to go after people who haven't done anything wrong. So that to me, to my mind, is why this conversation is important. So what is the transgender ban and what does the policy look like? So most of you probably know that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a law. And it was a law that said gays, lesbians, bisexuals cannot serve openly in the military. If they say that they're gay or engage in what was known as homosexual conduct in the statute, then they would have to be discharged. So that was a law, and it didn't apply to transgender people. And the rationale for the law, as all of you know, or most of you probably know, was a phony notion that the authors of the law made up, that if gays and lesbians served openly, that would hurt unit cohesion. So military readiness would fall apart, troops can't trust one another, straights don't like gays, we have to have this ban. That was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The transgender ban is different in a couple of ways. Because unlike Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the transgender prohibition in the military is a regulation, it's not a statute. And that is critically important because what that means is that President Obama or Secretary of Defense Hagel could get rid of it with the stroke of a pen. Just get rid of it. So at least for now, there could be a statutory backlash and the regulatory ban could become a statutory ban, but at least for now, we're fighting a much weaker target than we were fighting before. So that's one difference. A second difference is that unlike Don't Ask, Don't Tell, whose rationale focused on military cohesion and readiness, the policies prohibiting transgender military service are spelled out in medical regulations. So what you have is a medical ban. And I will apologize in advance as a social scientist that I'm going to geek out in regulations for the next few minutes. But I just want to kind of give a sense of what the ban looks like. And if you want more elaboration, you can ask. And if you want less, you can tune out. So there are two bans on transgender military service currently in place. One ban is the accession ban, or the enlistment ban, which is the ban that says that trans people can't join the military. So that's let's just call that the enlistment ban, and that's spelled out in medical regulations. There is a second ban that's spelled out in another medical regulation that is called a retention regulation. It doesn't have to do with whether you can get into the military, but it has to do with what happens to people who are already in. And what that regulation says is that if you're discovered to be trans while in the military, then that is the basis for administrative discharge. So you get fired if, so you can imagine a couple scenarios. Someone might join the military and not realize that they're transgender, and then slowly come to that realization, and the military might find out about it, and once they're in service, and so that second ban, that retention ban, would apply to them. Or they could know they're transgender and get into the military just by slipping through the recruitment process, but then be discovered or declare who they are once in service, and the retention ban would apply to them as well. So two different bans, the enlistment ban and the retention ban. Now, confusingly, there are sub-pieces to the ban that are important to know. So, and I'll just mention a couple of them. The enlistment ban over here, the ban on getting into the military, has two pieces. It has a physical piece and a psychological piece. And the physical piece says that you can't have abnormal genitals, which includes genitals that have been altered by gender-affirming surgery. So if you have surgery, or if you have abnormal genitals, abnormal is not my word, it's the military's. If you have abnormal genitals, you can't get into the military. So there's a physical piece of the enlistment ban. There's also a psychological piece which says that if you have a trans identity, regardless of whether you've had surgery, you can't get into the military either. So whether you have a trans identity and or you've had surgery, you cannot get into the military. The retention ban only has one piece, and that piece is a psychological piece, which says that if you have a trans identity, then you're going to get administratively discharged from the armed forces. So there is no physical components to the retention ban. One more piece of nuance, which can become important later in the story for political reasons, is that these bans are articulated both at the level of Defense Department-wide regulations, but also in service-specific regulations. So, for example, there is a Defense Department-wide enlistment ban against trans people joining the military, but there's also an Army regulation about that and a Navy regulation about that. Okay, so that is what the trans ban is. I'm going to segue from the regulatory conversation to what are we going to do about this conversation? What are we doing about this conversation? But before I do, I want to just ask, I want to kind of like take your collective regulatory pulses and see if you have questions or if there's any confusion or comment or pushback or grievance about where we are so far. Yes?
I have a question basically about why are there medical restrictions? I mean, first of all, is there support from the American Medical Association or the psychologist in terms of whether this is actually a psychological medical condition, number one. And number two, is it simply hormonal treatment somehow that's also clued into this of why it's unusual to, why this is a medical condition?
There's not a ban on cross-sex hormone treatment. In fact, many people in the military take hormones and steroids and all kinds of medications that look a lot like cross-sex hormone treatment. So no, that is not part of the ban. In terms of what's the rationale for the ban, so unlike Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where you had a congressional debate and so defenders of discrimination really had to step forward and explain what they were doing, that is not the case with respect to transgender military service. The people who wrote the medical regulations did so behind closed doors, and there was no public debate or conversation about what they were doing or why they were doing it. These regulations have language that's in some cases 30 years old. So in one sense, there is no official rationale for the transgender ban. At the same time, there have been some court cases over the last 33 years that have challenged the constitutionality of the ban, and the military has sent experts to court to testify and explain to judges over why the ban needs to be in place. And military officials have advanced 4 medical rationales for why the military discriminates. Number 1, cross-sex hormone therapy is just too complicated to administer. We don't know how to do this. You could have a trans service member fighting in a cave in the Middle East and they would lose their medications. And if they did so, that would be disastrous if they couldn't be restocked. Second of all, gender-affirming surgery is too complicated for our reconstructive surgeons to perform. We have no expertise in genital reconstructive surgery or top surgery or anything else related to that, and we just can't be, basically we can't be bothered to develop an expertise. Third of all, in terms of mental health, being transgender is a mental illness, and we can't allow a mentally ill population to serve in uniform. Fourth, as a result of the first 3 reasons, there's a question of deployability, and we need to have a force that's deployable outside of the continental United States, and transgender service members can't really be deployed. Does that make sense? Any other? Yes, go ahead.
Could I ask you to just step back a little bit, especially for those of us who are familiar with the ban on gays in the military, where we were talking about it being against the law in the military through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that ban on homosexuals in the military really goes back beyond Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's an article that describes what sodomy is in the UCMJ, and that goes way back to the time of, well, I mean, the prohibition for that goes back to the time of Washington, I think. And there was also another prohibition that was instituted by President Roosevelt in 1940 something, rather 42 or something like that. And so they had to rewrite some of those. I don't know what the status of the prohibition on sodomy is.
But tell me your question.
My question is, given that history, how is the ban on transgender, how does it parallel that? Does it just, you said maybe 30 years ago they came up with these medical regulations?
That's right, and we don't have a regulatory history of why the regulations were put in place in the first place, and some of the language actually seems to go back to the 60s. It is possible that the military actually wrote regulations that didn't even necessarily apply to trans people, to the extent that they didn't even have consciousness of trans identities at that time.
Yeah.
But then later were kind of back-ended into prohibitions against trans service, like you can imagine a regulation against abnormal genitals then kind of being applied retroactively. Not applied retroactively, but applied for purposes other than those that they were written to fulfill. But we don't have a regulatory history.
So we don't really know.
We don't know. We don't know. Anything else on the regs before we get to the politics? Yes?
Well, the enforcement.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell started, the counting of people was so critical, including the loss of very specific skill sets.
Yeah.
So what's going on in terms of documenting?
So it's fascinating. SPARTA, which is an organization of about 170 currently serving transgender service members in all branches of the forces, told me that they're aware of about 24 transgender service members who were fired over the last several years. But the military doesn't track the numbers who are discharged for being trans. And we, at first when they told me that, my legal staff and I were like, that can't be possible. And we scrutinized the the DD-214s, the various kinds of separation and discharge papers. And in fact, there is no designation that we can find for being discharged for being trans. It's called, something else.
Are they all the same though?
Or what all the same?
The dozen or so that, were they all classified similarly so that they're tracked by that way?
We don't know, and we tried to figure out and couldn't. Because I wasn't able to see the actual discharge papers of the people who were fired. I was just able to look at discharge papers and like what the forms look like, and then what the categories are that can go into the various lifelines. And then in terms of people who were denied enlistment for being trans, that is tracked. And the Pentagon told the Palm Center that 3 people over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years have been denied enlistment, but that is almost certainly an undercount. Okay, so, okay. I'm going to segue to a political discussion, and then I'll stop again. And I'll talk a little bit about the Palm Center. So I would ask that this actually be off the record, not because anything's a state secret, but just kind of